Hello and welcome to this live episode of the 1895 podcast with me, Thomas D.
And me, Rob Cockerill.
And I say this live episode, Rob, because we're here in Rotterdam at our European CO2 Summit. It's great to be back on the road with the 1895 podcast, isn't it?
It is indeed, and we're switching it up this year, aren't we? We've taken the leap to Rotterdam and embracing all the overlaps with decarbonisation as well.
We are, yeah. Well, one of our last live episodes was, of course, in Utrecht at our Specialty Gases Summit. But yeah, great to take it on the road and discuss CO2 today. And we've got a great panel to get into this with.
We have indeed. Would you like to introduce them, Tom?
Yeah, well, I'll briefly introduce them, but I think it'd be nice if they introduce themselves, I guess. But first we have Johan Desmet of Nippon Gases. We also have David Hurren of DAH Renewable Consulting, Christopher Carson of Carbonic Solutions, and Mick Avison of Landmark Power Holdings Limited. So first, David, I'll pass the mic to you and you can perhaps introduce yourself.
Yep, my name's David Hurren. I've got a background in CO2 that probably stretches back 27, 28 years, kind of through from times with Messer Air Liquide, and actually running my own consultancy, but also being part-time president of the BCG in the last couple of years.
Fantastic. Over to Johan.
Hi, my name is Johan Desmet. I'm business director of Nippon Gases for the region Benelux and France. And I'm glad to be back here. In fact, in Rotterdam, if you drive into Rotterdam with this nice weather, which is not so usual, you see that Rotterdam is really a city of resilience and progress. It's good to have this CO2 summit over here. So I've 23 years with Nippon Gases in all kinds of businesses, and I'm now responsible for all the business lines all over the Benelux.
Fantastic, and it is a wonderfully spring day here in Rotterdam, isn't it?
Hi there, I'm Mick Avison. I'm the CEO of Landmark Power Holdings. I've been in the power business for over 40 years, but I really didn't think I would ever get into capturing CO2. So it's interesting how the world has moved on, and I'm pleased to say that we managed to design and develop and construct the first power plant with carbon capture in the UK, and that is going through the final stage of its birth, I have to say, and we're hoping that we've already received into the tank CO2 molecules, so we know that the system is working, but now we have to get the liquefied CO2. I'm very pleased to be here. It's been quite an interesting journey. I had a drive over this morning. And you're absolutely right, it's a beautiful spring day. Most times I come to the Netherlands, there's always nearly like England with the cloud. But one of the things that we're doing is that we're marketing the CO2 through our distributor, and we're putting the bubbles in the water effectively. So it's for food grade CO2. There's many uses for CO2, and that will grow. So it's interesting how other people see this. We see the CO2 market growing with other uses, especially with synthetic aviation fuels.
Fantastic. Lots of topics on the agenda over the next couple of days. And finally, Chris.
Yeah, hi, Christopher Carson. It's always nice to be back here at the gasworld European Summit. So thanks for the invitation again. It's always a pleasure. It's nice to host you guys in the Netherlands as well, so close to home here. I'm the managing director of Biocarbonics in the UK, supplier of food and beverage grade CO2 into the market, and busy right now also with a new startup in the US, so that's keeping me very busy. And looking forward to the conversations around CO2 here over the next couple of days.
Absolutely, and it's an event that does only get bigger, expanding numbers, expanding audience, and the breadth of users or companies that we see at this event. I guess that says as much about the CO2 business in 2025 as anything else. First things first, before we dive into some of that conversation, Tom, shall we ask everyone what they're looking forward to out of this event?
I think so, yeah. I mean, a few of you were here not here, we were in Austria last year, but you were at the same event last year. Chris, you've got the mic there. So what are you particularly looking forward to over the next couple of days of agenda activity?
Yeah, I mean, what I find really interesting is the way the gas world has kind of expanded the scope that we're talking about. We're no longer just talking about supply and demand around merchant CO2, but we're talking about different things. We're talking about SAF. We're talking a lot more about DAC, and we're looking at sequestration and things like that. So I'm looking forward to the additional scope that has been kind of bubbling in the background all these years, but finally kind of coming out and front and center on stage.
And talking of bubbling in the background, I think that leads nicely into you, Mick. You've not been to this summit before, but what are you looking forward to?
Well, I'm looking forward to see the breadth of it, to be honest, because very often if you go to an energy event, it's very much focused on power generation or something like that. CO2, industrial gases, it's going to be focused. But I think we're crossing over, and there's a lot of cross-fertilisation with different industries. And recently we found ourselves now crossing into the data centre world. And one thing I'm really finding interesting is that the data centres can't get any power to grid, so they want something where they can actually have behind the meter, but they can't have dirty fuel behind the meter, because the big boys they won't allow them to actually do it. So for me, it's interesting to see how many different industries will actually be here, and I think it's important to widen the conversation. CO2 is not a dirty thing. It used to be, but now we're finding it's a commodity. And there's sequestration, there's SAF. Food and beverage industry has been around for a long time. But I think it's about time that we started to say that CO2 is useful rather than dirty, and that's what I'd like to see happen in this kind of forum.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we've discussed on stage. It's seen as a dirty word, CO2, but we're trying to prove it really isn't, is it? Johan, of course, platinum sponsors here at our event. I'm looking out at our exhibit space. I can see the Nippon Gases logo everywhere. Underneath the Nippon Gases mezzanine. So what are you looking forward to over the next couple of days?
Nippon Gases everywhere. Yes, I would be glad to sponsor this event. I would say Nippon Gases is now like 7 years named Nippon Gases, and I'd love to further expand our, let's say, branding. Also in this area, CO2, and it's like, I would say CO2 is tasty, and getting more tasty. What I'm looking for is tell what is the industrial gas perspective on the evolution of the dynamic evolution of the CO2 business and everything that's going around. I don't know these people, in fact, and I'm like 30 years in the gas business, so this is how interesting it is and how it's expanding. True, and it's very dynamic. I'm sure it's different than in Austria last year. Even in 1 year, things are changing a lot. So this is what I think I like to learn, especially I would say on CCU, utilization of the carbon and the CO2, rather than purely the sequestration, which is interesting, but we all know, I would say it's probably temporarily over the decades and not definitely. The challenge is really to make sure that we reuse the CO2 as much as possible.
Sure, great, and we'll get into some of that discussion shortly on this podcast. And David, a veteran to gasworld events, really. You've been at the CO2 Summit multiple times now. You're on stage tomorrow and the next day, of course. So what are you looking forward to?
Yeah, it's interesting to see how it's changed over the last few years in terms of, and it's great to see it here in Rotterdam. I think Rob and I had a conversation at the end of it and trying to, Innsbruck is a beautiful venue, don't get me wrong, but actually we as I looked over McDonald's this time, I missed the view of the mountains.
Not quite the same.
but the reality is that this is a thriving area, and there's a lot of work going on around capture storage. There's a huge new dynamic coming, and I think we need to be engaged in that. So I'm really excited. As you say, I'm chairing 3 sessions, and I would hate to pick between any of the speakers in terms of the favourites, but I think there's new voices in the room. There's more people coming and talking about things. So we've got CO2 Next and Portos coming, and I think some of those conversations and understanding the timelines, the dynamics, how that affects the economics, how that will affect some of the supply and demand side, but also what the new opportunities are. I think as well that utilisation piece is really key as well, to see how that will evolve. I spend a lot of time working in the biogenic sector. I do a lot of work around biomethane. So that concept of capturing from organics and actually then using or storage and how that might be utilised is a really important piece around decarbonisation. The UK has, in the last couple of weeks, issued its 7th carbon budget guidelines, and what you can see in there is the low-hanging fruit of power, or relatively low-hanging fruit of power, is going by 2030, and by 2030 onwards, it's going to have to be industrial decarbonisation. It's going to have to be a number of other things that come along, and you can start to see that engineered carbon removal becomes part of that. But we're still in a state where BECCS, bioenergy carbon capture and storage or utilisation, still isn't really clear within the policy piece. We know we need it. We know it's part of the process, but actually how is it going to fit? Where's it going to come? It's still a little bit misty and murky in terms of that, and certainly the timelines. But we know that if we don't start it by 2030, we're going to be too late in terms of any of the climate goals. So I think the stuff Mick's doing, all of those things come together. And we're now 5 years away from the end of the decade. We're kind of running out of time to get some of these things in place. So I'm really looking forward to those conversations and seeing where that future piece fits together.
Absolutely, and hopefully we'll dive into some of those topics in this episode. They'll very much underpin a lot of the event that's still to come. We'll also have some launches about how we're powered by Atom at the moment as well, as you can see on the wonderful display for this. But perhaps first we should get into the CO2 business as we know and love it today, the state of play in the market, with some of the questions we'll be asking our delegates actually on the event app across the next few days. We'd love to get all of your very informed thoughts first of all. So Tom, should we kick off the first question?
Yeah, let's kick off the first question. I've already seen it in the poll today. I know I've voted in it, and it's a question which really underpins this whole event, I guess. And that is, how concerned are we about the CO2 supply chain over the next 12 months? We've seen how volatile it can be over the last 12 months and more. But looking forward to the next year, how concerned are we about
Who wants to go first on
the
that?
CO2 supply chain?
I'll look at that one if you like. I mean, we go out there and we do a lot of market research, and so we get reports and from various different consultants, and they've got their views. So what we try and do is figure out, the range. Nearly every summer in the UK, there is a shortage of CO2, and since the fertilizer factories basically shut down or disappeared, that's made it even worse. And the numbers that I've had quoted to me, that nearly 50% of the CO2 in the UK is imported. Now, I don't know whether that's accurate or not, but that seems to be a consensus from various consultants. What we're trying to do is make it grow from home. So coming back to your point, is the fact that we're early, we've started. I've got a pipeline of projects to produce CO2 from power generation, so we're providing two services. One is providing clean power, and the other is recycling or reusing the CO2 from the flue gases. And we're using natural gas. We're also in discussions as well with a supplier of biomethane to blend the biomethane in the natural gas in the main pipework. So from a certificate point of view, we'll have a blending of anywhere between 10 and 20% of biomethane. So we're trying to bridge that gap. We have a sister company, or a daughter company I should say, in Sweden, where we are building a biomass plant where we'll have biogenic CO2, so we're putting CO2 capture on the back of the biogenic plant. And as you can imagine, Sweden's just literally carpeted with forest and a lot of residues. It's the best place to go if we're going to be using biomass. So the market next year is probably going to be no different to the market last year, because there's no more CO2 has come onto the market, no more food grade CO2. It's still being produced in the same way. Nobody else is producing it. So the DACs will be a long time coming through as well. So from my, I don't use Nippon gases, which I'm sorry to say, but my distributor, they're always telling me that they've got a shortage in the summer. So I expect this year to be the same, and next year as well, until the projects actually get up and running.
We'll edit that bit out, Johan, about Nippon. Chris, perhaps we should come to you because you're in a very good panel here, Mick, with people that know all about the CO2 supply. But Chris, you've given that talk for us a number of times at our event, so perhaps you could give us your update.
Yeah, I think we closed out the last conference with a question on stage about, has it changed? And my comment at the time was the same fundamentals are in place as they were, the last few years. So what I am seeing right now, and I'll talk kind of European-wide and then can kind of focus in on the UK specifically, but right now it's very quiet. The traditional supply chain has been very stable. We haven't seen big changes in energy prices that have been, changing the dynamics around ammonia production. Bioethanol production has been there, and those are kind of two of the bigger sources of CO2 across Europe. So it's been very, very calm, and going into this summer, it seems to be calm as well. There also are some additional sources popping up, some alternative sources we see coming online, some other types of sources like capture and power generation are coming on the line. So those were sources that during the crisis, people decided to invest in capacity, and they're just now finally getting to market. And so that's going to help a little bit. But I have to stick by what I said last year, that in general, the main dynamics are still there. We got stuff going on in North America that could change the way that bioethanol is imported and exported out of Brazil into different countries. If Brazil starts importing into Europe, we're going to see some problems with bioethanol, and that's going to cause some crisis, right? So some of those same volatile dynamics are still there in the marketplace that could cause problems. Right now, we're not seeing it, but they happen, and they happen fast. When they happen, it's always a surprise, and so I'd never say it wouldn't happen. Then if I focus onto the UK, I've got a little bit of a different perspective in the UK. There's been a lot of investment in small alternative source capacity that's coming online. We see it in our business right now, and we are starting to get sufficient supply in the UK, along with the imports that are coming in, but the imports that come in primarily are through a supply chain that's very well developed, and it's a low-cost supply chain, so it works. So I actually see, the UK being a pretty stable place right now, actually moving towards oversupply going into the next few years, and continental Europe being balanced with some volatility, and that same volatility is in the UK as well with bioethanol if something should happen in the economics around the bioethanol market.
Absolutely. It does feel almost unseasonably calm in CO2 markets for a couple of years now. I'll talk a bit about that tomorrow, actually, from CO2 View's perspective. And I also had a conversation with a face familiar to many of us, an ammonia analyst, actually, on Friday night, who told me a few things about the flat position in ammonia markets at the moment. So maybe we shouldn't get too ahead of ourselves with that safety net.
Can I just make one response, I suppose? We encountered something recently which was the biggest thing that I've ever encountered, had to encounter, believe it or not, is that my site was inspected by the rabbi. Mm-hmm. So he could give me a kosher certificate for the food grade CO2. I'm talking about some of the alternative supplies that are coming on the market. They're coming from the biomethane plants. So they would not get, potentially, a certificate for the food grade market. So we have to be a little bit careful in how we understand, molecules of CO2, there's probably going to be quite a few around, and as you say, but what's it going to be used for? So for welding, not a problem. But going into the food grade market where we have a multicultural society in the UK, and one thing that we had to do was to get this certificate. So I think that it will be interesting. But all I can do is say my distributor is getting quite worried about the summit.
Okay, and that's a perfect segue to move on to our next question, which I think it'd be appropriate to come to you for, David. Where do you see the next big opportunity in that new CO2 sourcing? We've alluded to it a little bit here.
Just before jumping into that, so just under half of the CO2 is imported into the UK, and about, more than half of that CO2 that's importing is coming from the Netherlands. So there's a big dependency on that North Sea basin. So the dynamics are very complicated, is what I would say, in terms of where it goes. So changes in the Dutch markets can also affect the UK. And even if we've seen in the first half of this year, maybe up to about 10% of the market size new capacity coming on, there's still a lot of challenges, as you say, both in terms of ammonia, and there's still a vulnerability around that, but also around the bioethanol markets, and there's a lot of changes and challenges within those sectors as well. So it's a complex story. Even if things are quiet, go back to Chris's point, it doesn't take a lot to suddenly flip that around and suddenly start to cause a certain amount of stress. I mean, in terms of those growth markets, then I think we've seen that there's increasing support for SAF, particularly over e-methanol, but I was at a bio-LNG conference and again talking to some of the shipping people. There's a move to methanol and e-methanol as well as part of that shipping requirement. So I think we're going to see part of that. And if you look at the European shipping directive that's come out to drive some of those alternative fuels, effectively the penalties are built around a carbon price that's about 670 euros a tonne. So there's a lot of kind of backup stuff in terms of the penalties and incentives. The challenge we've got is that actually to move forward to some of those new fuels, you've got two routes, one of which is based on early waste and the conversion route. Second is to take hydrogen and CO2. And the interesting thing is that you can go and find hydrogen, but it will be expensive hydrogen where the CO2 and the biogenic CO2 is. You go to Norway, and I was at a conference last June, and they can produce relatively cheap hydrogen, but they've got no biogenic CO2 there. So what you're seeing is a kind of mismatch in the locations between where there's lots of biogenic CO2 and where there's cheap hydrogen are not the same. So getting that matching up at the economics is dependent. But we're also seeing a lot of kickback around Chinese imports of used cooking oils. Is the EU going to put some tariffs on that, or actually restrictions and quotas? How's that going to drive us sitting against the SAF directive that is small and ramping, but actually is incredibly punitive, particularly the European version, is incredibly punitive. You miss your target and you get fined, but what you miss your target by gets added to next year's target. So this starts to take off quite quickly in terms of the impact. So early days yet, we're seeing definitely more scale up and ramp up, but how much will come from oily waste, how much will come from CO2 and hydrogen, still a bit of an unknown.
Sure, thanks for that, David. And Johan, we'll pass it over to you. Where do you see the biggest opportunity in that new CO2 sourcing? We've already discussed DAC, for example, and we will be on stage with a full panel dedicated to it. So where do you see the biggest opportunity?
Good question, and I need to say it. 50% of the 50% is Nippon Gas shipping it in. I had to say this. Yeah. I'm sorry. We're sponsoring. So about the biggest opportunities, and indeed the challenge is still supply and demand. It is the story of CO2 already for so many years, and it will be the story even in a larger magnitude in the far future. It's what you just explained. It's one of the biggest. Where we see it, I think on the biomethane, biogas upgrade, and the biomethane, biomass, as you said, it's in the end, it's gonna be the source of the circular CO2. So once we really would get out of fossil in some time from now, you still need a carbon molecule. For all kind of plastics, for everything that we see, it's all carbon molecule. You still need a carbon molecule. So it will have to come from somewhere. It will have to come from circular. And that's probably going to be bioethanol, biomass related. But we're far from there. So it's with some big steps and some with small steps. And so I think we're all trying. I'm very interested about the DAC, the direct air capture, to see where that technology is and what's because that might be kind of a jump forward if that technology really would break through. Interesting what is going to be said this conference about that.
Yeah, and we've had some varying views on that, both in our European summit, we've had it in our US summit, varying views on direct air capture and the capabilities of it. I guess to flip that question I've just put to you, Johan, on its head, when we look at demand, where do you see the greatest new applications potential on a demand point of view?
Yeah, I would say there's let's say classic and short-term view first maybe, and that demand is like just following production in industrial production rates, as CO2 is used in producing like beer, and you produce more beer, there's more CO2. It also sometimes is used to enhance production, like in freezing applications, you can do like the double of the freezing at the same surface if you do it with CO2 instead of classical refrigeration. So that's where there is back again industrial production increase required. CO2 will also grow more than the industrial production. So these are kind of the classical. We see now at this moment, by the way, in greenhouses, a lot of growth of this has more to do with the natural gas electricity balance, and there's all stopping their cogeneration plants that they have. So they don't inject CO2 via the cogeneration anymore, and so they need like direct supplies of CO2. So that's where we see. On the longer term, it's gonna be more about, I think, the cost of the CO2 and what can it be afford. So I always wonder, is SAF is sustainable aviation fuel or synthetic aviation? I know it's synthetic, but it should be sustainable. Kind of.
Well, that's the target.
That's the final target. So
maybe it's another conversation how we're going to get into this, but there's not enough biogenic CO2 in the world to make the amount of SAF that's required. That's it. End of story. So you've got to make CO2 another way, which is the only cleanest way you can make CO2 is from a natural gas process. So then you've got to find how do you then make the CO2 from a natural gas process in a most sustainable way. So that's where you look at the power generation side, where you're getting two bites at the cherry. So what's interesting at the moment is the capacity market in the energy business closed last week at £60. Because it's well recognised that natural gas fired power stations are still required, and that's a 15-year contract. So gas is not going away. Natural gas is not going away. So we've got to do something with it. And one thing I think we do have to do is help industry like the cement industry to be able to capture the CO2 from the cement industry. And the legislation in the UK at the moment is only focused on decarbonising the national grid. It's not decarbonising industry with the consultations that are out at the moment. So I think it's all about, is there enough biogenic CO2? No, I mean, what you need 6 to 1 in terms of ratio for hydrogen and CO2.
Chris, maybe that's teed you up nicely, and to open that question up to you on the exciting applications of CO2 that you see.
Yeah, I mean, we talked last year a little bit about SAF, and we also see sequestration as a sort of demand center, right? That's how we view it. If there are opportunities to inject underground, it becomes a demand, and it's a demand driven by carbon credit value, right? But I see SAF and e-fuels in general and sequestration still far away. And I think there's, we've mentioned already the kind of the amounts, the volumes that are required for if you get into commercial production of SAF or something like that, or e-methanol. The numbers are gigantic, and it just diminishes our whole it makes our whole merchant market for CO2 look very, very small all of a sudden. So there is that aspect of it that I still haven't gotten my head around, and I'm not sure what to expect in the future. So, how are we going to get all that biogenic CO2, and how are you going to get it to a commercial size facility? We're talking about 80 trucks a day, and some numbers like that to service these. So if we step back into the merchant market, we see dry ice still being a big driver in the market. Dry ice has come on since the COVID times and continues to grow strongly. More transport is happening, more shipping of high quality food products is happening, and that dry ice is playing a role there. So that's been a real strong segment. Greenhouses is one, and it comes and goes with pricing. If the pricing goes high, they drop out of the market because they can't afford it. It's no longer worth the cost of the CO2. So that one has a lot of potential still to continue to grow, but it depends a little bit on what happens on pricing. So those are the areas that I see as the real the real potentials.
Sure, thank you for that, Chris. Now, let's switch this conversation up a bit, I think, and let's move on to something which I know is not everyone's favourite topic. Rob, I think we've discussed it on the podcast before, but on policy and regulation. David, you touched on it earlier. So perhaps, I don't know who wants to take this first, but what do you see as the most effective policy measures that the EU can adopt to reduce CO2 emissions, but still ensuring that there's economic growth as well as that important energy security, which is underpinning this event and this conversation we're having right now? Who wants to take that?
Thank you. I will save you.
Yeah,
Big question, David. Come on.
It is a big question in terms of. Look, I think what we're stuck with the challenges basically is affordability of energy. We've seen that, and the variability, and that has a huge impact. The UK's to some extent decarbonised by exporting its manufacturing. It's exported its CO2 to other places. So you look at the high intensity energy sectors and the UK's lost that. Well, that's not really solving your carbon problem in there that goes. So I think we've kind of missed a trick around that. And certainly what's missing is a really true carbon value mechanism. The UK's ETS is illiquid. It's dominated by a few small suppliers. There's a lot of challenge around that. So I think what we will need to see is, we've got an industrial carbon dioxide market at the moment, which is very insulated from the effects of storage and what those markets for storage are. So unless you actually have a mechanism which actually becomes and starts to really ties all of the policy together around CO2. So, and we're seeing that a little bit with biomethane. The government is looking to change the biomethane policy in the UK, and that is going to be linked to the ETS. There's a very clear message around that. It's been quite subtle. I gather on the latest CO2 production that opened, that will be tied with biomethane going to AstraZeneca, so it's completely unsubsidised. The minister came to that and talked about it and talked about the link with ETS. So bear it very much in terms of the fact that there will be a move forward. So I think trying to do all these things in silos without any reference to a kind of cost base is challenging. However, we also know that governments have managed to be very good at creating distortions. And that's the biggest worry, is that they start to do things which start to affect other parts of the market. And I've been involved with some of the consultations around non-pipeline transport of CO2 in the UK, because there's a move there to try and move that, and how are we going to regulate that and what's that going to be? The worry, you sit there and go, well, hold on a minute, we've been doing non-pipeline transport of CO2 for quite some time now, and actually, how's that going to impact on the markets? Now, the reality is, I sat in a session and someone kind of went, well, we're not interested in 10,000 or 100,000 tonnes. I've got a plant in Wales and it'll do 1 million. We don't care about the rest of you. And I think the slight worry I've got is all of that focus today and all that policy is on very big single emitters, and it's not looking at those opportunities for biogenic and that bioenergy piece. That's where we're not going to see that connection, and we may cause distortions.
Absolutely, and it will be interesting to see what we hear tomorrow from the European Biogas Association in their session 1, in fact, so that'll be great. David, let's stay with you for a minute if we can. Sorry, passing
trying to get away.
Trying to pass the mic away. You touched on hydrogen a little bit, we have across the panel, but how can the EU leverage green hydrogen and renewable energy technologies to reduce CO2 emissions, and what does it mean for the CO2 stakeholders in the room?
Just as an interesting side stat, because I was looking at some of the data I'd seen for yourselves globally, by 2030, the market for green hydrogen will just about be 3 times bigger than the market for CO2. So it kind of gives you a sense, but to be fair, the CO2 market is not talked about, the green hydrogen market is talked about a lot. So it's still a significant market and player in there. The challenge we've got with hydrogen is that it ties back to energy prices. Ultimately, if you can get cheap and disposable or flexible energy, then you can start to drive drive your hydrogen costs down, at which point some of that starts to look economic against other solutions. I think we've got a flip side where energy costs have been driven higher because we're trying to reduce the emissions from that and where it goes. So unless we can really get to a point where we get sustainable, cheaper energy, the hydrogen's really not going to kind of flow from that. We will get some hydrogen production from natural gas as well, so it won't all be electrolysis. And if we can tie that to capture, maybe that will offer some opportunities. But I think it ultimately ties back to a cost of energy, ultimately in some way. And whether it's the gas price or whether it's the electricity price, both of them are having an impact on how much it's costing us to produce hydrogen and where. So unless we find a method to drive that down and make the EU look competitive, then we have a massive challenge. And what we've got to recognise is there are places in the world where energy is a lot cheaper, and that's why we're seeing ammonia potentially being shipped into Europe, because of the fact that it's cheaper there. And I had the same conversation with a working group back on data centres. You're talking about there's a data centre in Arizona which is taking about the third the energy that London does, but you're paying cents in the pound, cents in the dollar basically. The energy cost is a fraction. So those markets, much as you would like to talk about this being European, become global. So
that's a great lean in there. I don't know if we'll stay with you or not, David. we can move the mic around. That sense of global cooperation, what can Europe learn from other regions such as Asia or North America in addressing CO2 emissions, accelerating the green transition and leveraging that in the CO2 industry? Tough question. We're passing this around.
It's tough, but anyways. So I'm based in Antwerp, by the way, and so 2 weeks ago there was in Antwerp the signing of the Clean Industrial Clean Act from the European Commission. It's kind of a review of the Green Deal to be a bit more towards the industry, and the reaction of the large industries that were there, and I agree with you. It's mainly based on the large industries, so like steel, cement, petrochemical, refining industries. But anyway, these are also important players also. So the reaction was okay, but so at least there is an improvement. But there is still some buts, and one of the buts is, I think, where we are all jealous on the IRA Act in the US, is how simple it is and how little of administration it requires and control. So this works like, okay, if you can prove upfront how much CO2 you avoid to emit in the air, this is the tax reduction that you get. It's as simple as that. It's not like you have to have a subsidy file that you first have to put in there. You work 2-3 years for that, then you maybe get it or you may not get it. If you get it, you have to prove every cost that you do, and you have to prove all the results that you do for a 10 or 15 year period. So you see how quickly decisions are made in the US, just based on how much tax reduction they will immediately have, and how long it takes for companies in our customers, in fact, or the people that needs to do carbon capture, how difficult and long time it takes for them. So we are kind of losing time and getting delayed by both Asia and US.
Absolutely, we are losing time. We constantly talk about that on our webinars, actually. How many times have we been told, oh no, it's fine, it's 2030, it's only 5 years away, less than 5 years now. And that might be one of the few things we're envious of the US about right now as well, I should say. Rather volatile atmosphere. If we move into the final part of this podcast and tackle a couple of quick fire final questions. We've got a DAC or DAC panel tomorrow. That's direct air capture, of course. There's a lot of debate around this, as Tom said earlier. What are your thoughts on DAC, and what question would you like to see asked in that panel tomorrow? Perhaps we'll go around the room. We'll start with Chris.
Yeah, so DAC is a tricky one for me because my background is CO2 production, and purity is everything in CO2 production. Purity drives the cost of actually, purity of the raw gas drives the cost of what it takes to produce pure CO2. And when you start out with 400 parts per million, that's you got to move a lot of gas to get to the CO2 that you need. So those are fundamental things, and so the big question that I have with DAC is how are we coming down that cost curve, right? And how do we ever make that a real viable and large scale opportunity when we still have point sources that are still 90% CO2 all over the place that we can tap into. That being said, I do see that DAC has the beauty of being able to place it down anywhere. And so that's the strength. So I'm also interested to see some of these markets and some of these very specific opportunities and applications that DAC is chasing, and kind of see what those look like and where they are.
Sure, thank you for that, Chris. And we'll continue down the line. Mick?
I think it's another alternative way of producing CO2. So, I'm a great believer in making sure there's more than one solution to everything. And very often you can look at maybe hybrid solutions as well. The thing about that I see with DAC, number one, it absorbs energy. So somebody's got to produce power. It's got to have a grid connection. And at the moment you can be waiting 7 years in the UK for a grid connection. So there is an issue in time in that respect. But I think the concept is okay. I'm just not a believer at this stage. It's a bit like SAF. SAF is there. We all know chemically it can be done, but nobody's gone out there and built a huge SAF plant. If you want to build a huge DAC plant, then you won't get planning permission in the UK, for sure. You're going to have to go to some of the other regions of the world, in the States in particular, or even China, where they've got plenty of space. And, how much noise do these things make? So when you start looking at where you actually put these things, there's the planning consent process would certainly slow things down quite a lot. So, again, probably stick to what we do best. We know how to extract CO2 from gases, and the concentrations are a lot higher. It's the quick solution and the quickest solution. But I wouldn't decry DAC. I think it's something, as things get better and the development of the technology gets better, it's something worth looking at.
Great, thank you, Mick. And Johan?
Very well, and you're already with your foot on the ground. I'm still in the air. I love the idea of that because it's kind of air separation. It is kind of air separation, and so as an industrial gas, you like the idea. I think it's still far away. This is I fully agree with that. But from an ID point of view, I love it because it's really air separation. You could make oxygen from other processes as well. You don't do that because air separation is there for 100 years. So that's why you do it like this way. Anyway. Though one of the big advantages is that the high concentrated CO2 streams from the great emitters that we know, kind of easily to capture, they have the disadvantage, they have all these impurities. And so we're involved in a carbon capture project for a steel company and want to make it food grade, so which you can. It's not impossible, you can. But the guarantee that it always will, and that not one molecule will slip through somehow, that's where everybody, Coca-Cola, is afraid of. So this is I would say in the long-term future, DAC has this, just like air separation, it's kind of easy. And it's an easy process from that point of view. And it solves this impurity thing, which is maybe better for sequestration yet and make it there okay for. But to go really into the food industry, now beverage and so on, we will have to put in a lot of guarantees, and that's also very costly on the...
Thank you, Johan. Great to see these varying views and various takes. David, how about you?
I think as a chemical engineer, I kind of came in a bit like Chris, basically, originally thinking, why would you start with such a low concentration in the first place? This is kind of nuts. But to be fair, I kind of spent some time at previous pieces with some of your panellists who will be back here again. And I've changed my opinion. I've kind of a bit of a domestic road around some of it. I'm not saying it DAC is there for everything, and it's certainly, I think, for food, it's not its marketplace. What you would have to do to validate the quality, and because of its scale, there's kind of a mismatch between the two. But I think that concept of, you look at how much of what we do is the cost of production, but also what the cost of transport is. And it's actually being able to have the CO2. There are certain areas and applications where actually being able to have the CO2 at the place you want it is a major advantage. And if you can do that in an area where energy is cheap, and then maybe you can make cheap hydrogen, then all of a sudden you may actually start to begin to have the elements of something that makes sense. However, to do that, we still need to come down the cost curve. We still need to build at scale. So there's still work to be done around that. But I think it's a tool within the box. It's not the panacea. It's not the solution for everything, but it's definitely a valuable tool. And I think it's about, there will be geographies and markets where it has its niche.
Great, and it is a market that we've seen develop quite a lot over recent times as well, and no doubt continue to. So it'll be interesting to see where we are in perhaps 2 years' time. Perhaps we get all four of you back for that. But one final quick fire question. We'll go down the line once again. A broad question here, I'll admit, but if we're putting together a wish list, what's the one thing you would like to see in this CO2 business going forward?
I think basically we need to. So I'd like to see the growth. I'd like to see the growth come in a transformation where we're seeing valuation into utilisation. We're seeing new utilisation markets particularly, and I do worry because the U of CCUS has dropped out in a lot of policy. So I think that utilisation piece is really still key, but also moving to starting to get to the point where we are really using all that biogenic material. There's a lot of biogenic material out there that's not being used. It's neither been used for energy, nor has it been used for carbon capture. And actually, if we are to get to a net zero, we don't do it without using those organics. So I think a real focus on seeing those organics not as waste, but as an energy resource and a source for biogenic CO2, which has value, both in terms of the markets, but also in terms of carbon reduction. That's probably the biggest change in emphasis and focus.
Fantastic. Underline some of the themes for the event, waste to value.
Yeah, I think so. Waste into feedstock, change that biogenic material from waste to feedstock. It's one that will help for that. And I fully agree with, as an engineer, with further developments on utilization, CO2 into CO maybe, and then CO further, which are very interesting building blocks. So all this technology, which didn't exist like many years ago, and start to come. So I do believe that high needs create high creativity and new ideas. That's what we already saw, and will come in the future as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Johan. Mick?
I have to say that my stumbling blocks to actually build a project is the understanding and education of government officials, environment agency, funders. At the moment, there is nothing out there explaining what use of CO2, how good it is and why it's useful. So we have an awful lot of explaining to do, let's put it that way, in the due diligence. And that is stopping money coming into the business. That's what will be holding back a lot of these projects. So when we get to 2030, we won't get there with the targets we've got because the people with the money will actually stop it. So what we have to do is educate. So that's my wish for the next 2 or 3 years, is to get more and more of the education out there with government departments and investors. So doing a nice roadshow around the city, for example. And I'll be starting that myself with the government department. They've asked to meet up with us because they want to know how we've done it. And that's a worry.
And I hate to sound like a broken record, but we do have validation, due diligence, and of course investment and finance on the agenda over the next couple of days. Chris, final thoughts for you?
I think if I can choose anything, I want more concrete development in the sequestration and the e-fuels world. Because when I look into my crystal ball, it's very, very cloudy as long as I don't know what's going to happen around sequestration and what's going to happen around e-fuels. Those are such big movements and such big demands or sinks for CO2 that they will change our industry. They could blow it up into something that's gigantic, or if they just kind of fizzle out, it can create some real challenges in the future going forward with supply and demand balancing. So I'd like to see real concrete understanding of what's going to happen in the e-fuels world. What's sequestration going to look like? What does that value chain look like? And where is our CO2 going to go? Is it going to go to e-fuels? Is it going to go to sequestration? Or is it just our utilization market as we've kind of traditionally known? And when that becomes clear, I think we'll be able to relax much more around our business and be able to plan.
Absolutely, and we want even more concrete insights. Hopefully we've built some over the past hour, Tom, in this episode, and really that is the start of the journey. I mean, we can hear the footfall building in the exhibition area, so we should probably start to wrap this up.
Yes, we should probably start to wrap up, but Chris, Mick, Johan, David, thank you for joining us today on the 1895 podcast. We're going to be back in our next episode of the podcast with our review on this very event, aren't we? So it'll be interesting to get back into some of those presentations and the takeaways and perhaps compare how this conversation started to what we hear over the next couple of days.
Yeah, maybe we'll catch some of our guests as well at the end of the 2 days and see if we can get a little clip from you for the next episode.
Yeah, let's do it. But in the meantime, to our listeners, please do like, follow and share the 1895 podcast.